All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our April Cost Growth Target Technical Advisory Group. I'm Sarah. This is my cat, Byron, who's joining us today. Sorry for that. I am filling in for Trang and facilitating today. And let's jump right in with some general housekeeping and agenda review and all of that good stuff. So this meeting is being recorded. Please put yourself on mute until we get to the discussion parts of the agenda. We will mute you on our end if there's some background noise if needed.
Years in jail.
Although maybe that is a test of our ability to mute you on our end. So please keep yourself on mute. Feel free to use the chat for questions as we go. And just a reminder, if you are able, it really helps to put your organization name as part of your name for this meeting so we know who all is in the meeting. As our tag continues to grow, we are not doing full roll call. We will pick that up in terms of who's participating from the chat. Next slide, please. So we have a really full agenda today. We are going to briefly review the March meeting and the updates from that. We have a couple of program updates, status updates on things, and then we're going to spend the bulk of the meeting talking about the 2022 data submission document, so the template and the guidance, and preview some of that for you. And then we're going to start talking about accountability and the performance improvement plan template and development of all of that. So let's go ahead to the next slide, please. And one more. So the March meeting recording is posted on our tag website for those of you who may have missed that or want to listen back to anything that is available. A couple of things that we wanted to just refresh everyone on from that meeting last month. We talked about how dual member payments are collected and we're making the change to collecting dual member payments using paid amounts, and all of the other lines of business will use allowed amounts. We talked about risk adjustment using demographic factors, and we'll talk more about that later today. And we started previewing the template and the validation process changes that we are rolling out for the 2022 data submission cycle. Are there any questions about the March meeting summary? Hearing none, let's go to program updates. Next slide, please, Johnny. And one more. So just a quick update on the status of the initial data submission and data validation. So as of April 15th, we have over 90% of covered lives in Oregon represented by the finalized files. We are still outstanding. There are 3 data submitters that are still outstanding that will represent the rest of the covered lives that we're waiting for. And we are hoping to finish those up in the next couple of weeks. We'll see how we go. But again, this is just our quick status update on the covered lives and how that breaks down by market. Thank you again for everyone who's been participating with us in the data submission and validation and iteration process. Especially those of you who have finished and had a chance to share your reflections with us in those stage 3 meetings. And we really appreciate that feedback, and that's informing our development of the process for the 2022 cycle. Sam or Yishan, anything else we want to add on the validation side?
This is Yishan. No, I think that's good.
I think you got it.
Thank you. Next slide, please. All right, it is time to think about the 2022 data submission cycle. So over the last week, we sent notice out to all of the mandatory and voluntary data submitters that have been identified for the 2022 submission. So many of you on this call should have received that notice, or potentially others in your organization received that notice. We have posted to the website the notification letter and the list of mandatory submitters for next year. You can find that if you're curious. It is mostly the same. We had a couple of small changes, but for the most part, it is all of you, the same folks, same data submitters going through the next cycle. So that notification is out. There is an action item attached to that notification. If you are a mandatory data submitter, we do want confirmation of your contact information, of who your key point of contact is. So we've heard back from a number of you already. Thank you for that, for those quick responses. And those of you, if you have not responded yet, contact is, or your main point of contact for the 22 submission, please let us know soon. We have a quick update on the Cost Growth Target Advisory Committee recruitment and membership of that new committee. Next slide, Jorandi. So back in March, the Oregon Health Policy Board approved what we're calling an ideal committee composition matrix to help guide the membership and figure out where we needed to do any additional recruitment to fill any gaps before we were ready to present the full proposed committee membership slate for approval. So that ideal composition matrix is available online in the March Policy Board materials. The board did approve that. We were looking at what the right representation would be for the new committee across a couple of different domains. So we thought about sector, so healthcare industry, payers and providers, as well as non-industry representatives. Thought about demographic representation, race, ethnicity, age, sex, geography. And then we looked at experience, including lived experience. So what specific expertise are people bringing to the committee? And so looking for the right mix of folks across all of those domains. The May Oregon Health Policy Board meeting is coming up next Tuesday, and at that meeting, we will present a proposed membership slate for their review and hopefully for their approval. Then, if they approve it next week, we will be able to convene the committee in late May or June. And so we're getting ready to send out notice to everybody and get all of the balls rolling on the committee as soon as we have policy board approval. The proposed meeting slate should be part of the policy board meeting materials posted publicly by the end of the week. It is not current yet, but it should be out. Today's Wednesday, either Thursday or Friday of this week with that proposed slate, and we can send a link out to all of you when that is available. And I see a hand, Vince.
Yeah, sorry, I missed. Which meeting was it that they posted the matrix that you're talking about?
March.
So the March 8th meeting.
Yes.
Or is that's the educational webinar, so it might be the March 1st meeting.
March 1st was the regular board meeting.
Okay, thanks.
And they approved the material that's posted is the draft composition matrix, but they approved it as is.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions about the advisory committee recruitment? I know this has been a long process, and hopefully we will get the committee off the ground this summer. Okay, next slide, please. And then last program update, we did hold our initial cost growth target public hearing a couple weeks ago, Friday, April 8th. This hearing focused on the impact of high and rising healthcare costs on people in Oregon. We had some really great panels with national perspectives, payer and provider perspectives, and actually hearing from consumers and small businesses, those purchasing healthcare for their employees. And that second panel with the consumer impact in particular was really powerful. If folks weren't able to listen to the hearing, the recordings, slides, public comment are all posted, and I really recommend listening to the second panel. It is definitely worth your time. Also related, on Monday of this week, which was just 2 days ago, we published a report that summarizes a lot of the data on the impacts of high and rising healthcare costs. So this is a lot of survey data, national data, economic data looking at healthcare costs as a % of household budgets. So that really solidifies some of what we heard in the public comment and public testimony in the hearing. And so those two things packaged together. And that report is on our website. And we can drop the link in the chat if folks haven't seen that yet. Any questions about the public hearing, the new report, or any of these program updates? Okay, let's keep going. I'm going to hand it over to Yishan to start talking about the 2022 data submission documents.
Thanks, Sarah. For So, good morning, everyone. I'm Yishan, Summer Research Analyst with Cost Growth Target Program. And today I'm going to talk to you about the draft data submission template we have for this year to show you what changes we have made from last year's template. And then Sam, I'm going to hand it to Sam once we are going to the specification manual section. So let me share my screen for the draft template. Can you all see my screen now?
Yes, but it's very small.
Oh, okay. Let me. Is that readable?
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. Yeah. So for this year, the major change we have is that we add 3 validation tabs in our data submission template. So for the data submitters, you probably only need to just need to focus on the first 2 tabs, the TME validation and the provider check. The third tab, the demographic score for validation, that's just to calculate the demographic scores, which we call the risk score in the previous year. That was just a calculation for the TME validation. So for the data submitters, you just need to focus on these 2 tabs. For the TME validation tab, it's just show you the relationship between the TME all and TME prof and unattributed tab to make sure the sum of the member months and the dollars and the weighted demographic scores are matched between the TME all and TME prof and unattributed tab. Also, the member months between the TME all and the market enrollment tab should be matched to in this tab. I will go through this tab later once I finish all the 7 tabs we have. And for the provider check, it is just to make sure when you report the provider organization name in the TME prof, that provider organization name also being shown up in the provider ID tab with the associate teams. So that's a major change. And here I just want to acknowledge that all these 3 tabs are mainly done by Liz, who was our lead analyst for the validation process. And she is taking the new position with the public health division. So, but me, Sam, and Tran will still work very closely with the validation process this year. Let's go to the cover page. So there's not much change in the cover page. I would say the one big change would be we took out the table 1.1, which was the risk tool adjustment questions. If you remember the last year template, we have the table 1.1, which are a couple questions regarding the risk adjustment tools. But since now we are not using the risk scores anymore, we are switched to the demographic score. So we don't have that questions in the cover page for the current, for this year's data submission. And you would probably see some questions being highlighted in orange here. That's just some rephrasing questions. The questions still be like very similar to the previous one, but we're trying to make all the questions that you will answer yes. And if we answer no, you would need to explain the reasons in the comments fields. And we're trying to make more rooms for the comments so you are able to type more like your explanations in this cover page. So that's just the change for the cover page. Any questions for the cover page?
I apologize. This is Vince Porter at Regents again, and I apologize. I may have a lot of questions because my technical expert is not on, and I'm trying to take notes. The risk, understanding that we're moving away from the risk adjustment to this age and sex model, is that the correct? So
yeah.
So I fully understand it. Then you all will do those calculations on your end, or are we doing the calculations on the age and sex? Like we're just turning in the data and with no risk adjustment, and then you're handling.
Yeah,
Those
so
are
I
ju-
can take
Is
this
that
question.
later in the template?
Yeah, so we are going to provide the demographic score reference table. It's not in our draft template yet, but we will show that in the next month's tag meeting. But to calculate the demographic scores for each role, which in the TME all, you will need to use that reference table to get the weighted average with demographic score here. Sam, do you have anything to add for the demographic score?
Yeah, sure. Vince, it's a good question. It is going to be a bit of a change. And just like Ishan said, we're doing the calculating of the tables using Oregon APAC data that we will provide, but it is up to the submitters to do the roll up at each level and then provide us with the demographic score that you calculated using our tables. And we kind of have to do it that way because of the level of detail we're asking about the providers. Otherwise, we would do it ourselves. I know some of the other states' templates would just ask for some basic information from the submitters, and then you can kind of get the scores from there, sort of fall out. But because we need so much provider information, we're not able to do it that way. So we need actually the data submitters, that's you guys, to do it for us. So did that answer your question, Vince?
Yeah, it does. I think with anything like this that's new, I'm just trying to anticipate, especially, one thing, we will have a fair, like 50% of the people that worked on the report last time will be replaced by new people on our side just because of turnover. And so there's gonna be a re-education element on this already. And with this being new, I just want to make sure we're communicating back and forth about what we need to do.
And
Hey, Sam?
Vince, to that point, I think there's definitely turnover. We've heard this from a number of data submitters, and we know that you've got different folks or different teams that are working on this. And I just want to clarify that this tag meeting today is not the only time we are presenting the template. We will talk more about this in the rest of the tag meetings. We will do an orientation webinar this spring. So again, just definitely ask all your questions now, but don't feel like this is the only opportunity to understand the new template. We will do the same training and rollout that we did last year.
Hey, Sam? This is Greg. I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
And that's actually more of a comment. I know that early on when they talked about the demographic scores, originally there was this idea of look at the age of a person each month, and then you had a table that had like big, huge, periods of time, like 20-year, where you'd have the same factor for a person, that was for 20 years. It was a very small table. I know that we had already talked about that the probably the best way from my point of view actuarially is to just sit there and say you use whatever the age the person was at the end of the year. That's where you commonly see these kind of things applied. So that gives you it makes it easier for people to process it. It's not going to make a big difference than doing it by month. So we already talked about that. But I know that the tables that you had shown as that you might be putting out there were very small tables of like 4 or 5 cells. I would recommend you expand that out. You can even go out to 99 years. I mean, if you're running it through off the APAC data, it's not that hard to use a table of 99 rows versus 5, and you're going to get a much better comparison of movement from one year to the next because the age thing. Now I'm just using the extreme. You might sit there and say, well, we don't want to use 1-year age bands. Maybe we want to use 5-year age bands or something, or maybe we use 0 through 18 and then something like that. But from what I saw in the earlier one, I would recommend that you expand it out to make it a little more comprehensive table for the demographic factors.
Yep, I appreciate that, and we definitely have looked into making some changes. And you're right, the as far as the calculating of the age themselves, yeah, you're right. Using the end of the year age of the member to do the calculation will make that significantly easier, a lot better processing. As far as the age bands, we've done some analyzing of the market level age bands, and Compared it to some of the other states and some other demographic tables that we can get our hands on, and done some regression ourselves to see what the change year over year would be if we made smaller age bands or, got more specific with it. I think you'll find that the change isn't all that great when you move from 10-year age bands to 5-year age bands for many of the cases, because the incremental change just doesn't make up that much of a difference. But yeah, it is something we're considering. And I definitely appreciate everybody's thoughts on that. We're doing the best we can, but we want to make it not too overly burdensome, to make it having to intake a large table, but we also need it to be, we need to have some significance. We need it to make sense to that each year that some aging occurs, that we're not going the wrong direction with the factors. And if you do every single age, that can certainly happen very quickly. You start going in reverse or going backwards, which is not something that we find to be realistic. So I think there's some balancing that we have to do, and we're doing some checking with the APAC data to make sure that we have enough data to do it.
I want to jump in, sorry, Sean and Sam, and to just reset the stage. I think today what we're previewing is still the draft template and the draft guidance. So please ask your questions, please make suggestions. There was a question in the chat about when the final template will be out, and our goal is to publish the final template and the final guidance for the 2022 data submission by the end of May. So today is, feedback, questions. This is not the final, everything is done and locked down. So please keep the questions coming. But just wanted to say that up front, that the final versions will be out next month. And this is a preview of the changes and pressure testing to make sure we didn't miss anything.
Thanks, Sarah and Sam. Do anyone has questions for the cover page or the demographic score?
We've got a question in the chat about member months and whole numbers versus decimals. Do we want to take that now or wait till we get to another tab?
Yeah, actually, I can take that one now. So yeah, for the member months, we decide still use the whole number for now, because if you see the TME prof and TME unattributed tab, we have or no, maybe I should change to the demographic adjusted standard deviation PMPN. Because when you calculate a standard deviation, we do need a whole number member month. So we want that to be consistent across the rows. So that's why we still decide to use the whole number for the member months.
Does
that
a
answer
good
the
window
question?
to talk about the rounding up and down and what we want to do with that? Or Sam, are we not ready to talk about that yet?
Oh, we can talk about it. That's coming up in the manual section. Tracy, specifically Tracy, since you're asking, not to call you out, but I'm wondering if was there a specific reason why you're hoping for decimals in that section? Is it just an ease of input, or was there a mathematically relevant or confusing thing that we're asking for?
Well, it's
so
just with the Medicaid population, a lot of the members are not on the entire month. They can be on a few days, they could be on, half the month. And so when we initially were rolling up the member months and counting the member months, obviously we had, a decimal. And so we were just wondering why you wouldn't want the actual member month total, that you would want us to round up or round down. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I think a lot of it had to do with the risk adjusted or demographic adjusted now standard deviation, where we wanted to have some consistency, where we didn't want a decimal point member month in there. However, and this is just a preview, we're not going to skip too far ahead here, but there were some issues in this last submission year with rounding down to 0 occasionally. That might be part of what you're concerned about too, is if we're rounding down to 0, we're going to get some divided by 0 errors, and it's going to make everything a lot uglier on both your end and our end. So we do have some new language in the manual that's going to reference what to do if you round down to 0, which in this case means move that member from the TME Prov tab, which is the provider specific tab, to the unattributed tab. So if you, instead of having, if you do have 0 member months or you're rounding down to 0 member months for a specific row, just move them over to the unattributed tab. We have that language currently in the manual. That's what our draft is saying. However, internally, we're still open to and seriously considering setting maybe a higher bar for that round down, move over to the unattributed tab. And I'd like, everybody's thoughts on that when we get to it. But if in the TME Prov tab, if you have a row that only has like 5, 8, 10 member months, that data is good and we need to capture those claims, but at that small of a level, that provider is not going to be held accountable at any point, and that data isn't really going to get used anywhere. So if we set a minimum bar of 10 member months to include on the TME Prov tab, everything else move over to the unattributed tab, because we can collect a little bit more data there and sort of make that that TME Prov tab a little bit skinnier, maybe a little bit more manageable for everybody. I think that there might be some utility there. And I'd be interested in everybody's thoughts on that, and maybe that would alleviate some of the questions we'll be getting about member months and some of the difficulty we had this past submission. So we can talk a little bit more about that later, but that's just a little preview. I would like everybody's thoughts on that if anyone sees a problem.
My first thought is, I'm just thinking in terms of, I've got a provider. It almost guarantees that you might have one member who falls into it, and now I'm splitting up a provider's dollars for that one person and creating double the amount of stuff by doing the unattributed. So it seems like, we're Kaiser, so right now we don't have any really unattributed. We're unique, but now I'm taking somebody who I know is Kaiser, and I'm creating an unattributed for a person who's Kaiser, because they're only on for half a month or a quarter of a month or something.
So I think this would only not be applied at the individual member level, but at the aggregate row level. So if your
Okay.
row, which Kaiser, you are unique, but with many of the other data submitters, there were a number of rows where a member would be attributed to a provider that only had one member, and so that member would be for 6 months only, and they would take up an entire row, and that wouldn't really be useful for the data submitter or for us, because we can't hold anybody accountable for 6 member months. So just getting rid of that and moving it over to unattributed at the aggregate level for providers, not at the individual level.
Okay, that
Hopefully
helps.
makes more
Thank you.
sense. Sorry, I didn't clarify that.
Any other questions for that? If not, I'm going to go through this template. So for TME all, in addition to the demographic score, you may also notice that we allow more digits after the decimal point. So we now allow 5 digits after the point. So this is the purpose of this is we are able to calculate the cost scores rate over the years more accurately by allowing more digits after the decimal point. So that's the 2 things changed in this template. For the TME Prov, the same, the demographic score and the digits. Another thing we did in this tab is that we remove the provider last name and first name columns. So from the last year's submissions, we asked the last name and first name as the optional columns, but for the cost scores target, we really just need the provider organization at the organization level. So we think that last name and first name does not really helpful. In addition, that's just kind of confusing. So we decide to delete these 2 columns for this year's data submission. So that's for the provider organization and for this TME Prov tab. Does anyone have any questions for that? If not, I'm going to move to the Attribute tab. So it's the same. We have the demographic score and the more digits after the decimal point. For the market enroll tab, there's not much change either. We basically just changed the calendar year. Now for this year, we are going to collect the 2020 data and 2021 data. So you will need to report the member months for each market category in this tab. And for pharmacy rebates, we do some change, which we add one column. It's optional. You can provide a provider organization name if you know where the rebates come from by the provider organization. This is optional. So if you don't know that information, that's fine. Just leave this blank and then report the rebates at the market level as what you have done in last year. Any questions for the rebates?
Yeah, this is Vince at Regents again, and I know we've discussed this in previous meetings, and I'm just trying to remember. So there's the possibility that we will have some who will attribute these rebates to provider organizations, and some that will not. Have you thought about, like, does that change? Will that change how, like, different organizations will be scored? I mean, or is it is what it is, and you know?
Yeah, I can try that first, and then Sam and Sarah feel free to jump in. So I think this year we are still trying to test, more like a test to see how many or how much rebates can be attributed to the provider organization, because from the last year's template, we don't know that information. And I think this year we are just trying to see how much rebates could be attributed to the provider organization. But for the report and accountability, I think we are still not changed. Like the rebates still report at the market level, let's say that.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, this is whether or not we can get more granularity that helps us understand cost drivers better below the surface, but it wouldn't change, or hopefully would not create variation in what we're planning on reporting out at the accountable provider level.
Any questions for rebate? If not, let's move to provider ID tab. It's nothing
Hey,
changed.
Yishan, sorry, I want to just address a question that's coming in the chat.
Sure.
I think there are some changes to the template we're previewing versus the one that was sent out. We've, like I said, and like everyone said earlier, we've been iterating. So let us commit to, after this meeting this afternoon, we can send out the most current draft of the template that is being previewed today. Sound okay, team?
Yeah, sorry about that, because I think for the Excel file we sent out last week, we still use the risk score, but we feel that it's maybe more appropriate to use the demographic score here. So that's why I changed it to the demographic score. But yeah, that's just the draft, and then we will send out the update one after the meeting. Sorry about that. Right, so if there's no more questions for these 7 tabs, I'm going to do the Tme Validation tab. So for this tab, there are 3 tables. The first table is to compare the member months and the dollars between the Tme All and Tme Prof and unattributed tab. So we're basically trying to show if there's a difference between the member months and the dollars between the Tme All and the Tme Prof and unattributed tab. Here I provide some numbers, just some fake numbers here. So in this case, this pair have the lines of business 3 being reported. So in this case, you will only see this row have some number pop up. And if you see all the numbers are black, that means you pass the stage 1 pass this validation. But let's say if I change some of the member months number here to some other numbers, you will see the blue number pops up, which means you have much higher member months number in the TMEO compared to what we see in the TME Prof and attribute tabs. And if, for example, if I change this to like small number, you will see the rate number pop up because you have higher numbers in the TME Prof and attribute tab. And similar for the dollars. So for example, if I change this to some other number here, you will see the rate number pop up. So this is just give you the idea like how the dollars and the member months are different between the TME and TME Prop plus TME on attribute tab. So you can use this tab to do some validation check before you send out the file to us. Any questions for this table? If not, I'm going to move to the table 2, which is to compare the weighted average demographic score between the TME all and the TME Prop and TME on attribute tab. So in this case, let me change these to the right number. So yeah, in this case, if your weighted demographic score, it's the same between the TME all and TME Prop plus TME on attribute tab, you will see the difference will be 0. But if the numbers are not the same, for example, if I change this to 2, you will see the blue number pop up because you have a higher demographic score in the TMEO. And similar, if you change this number to a smaller number, then you will see the rate number pop up in the difference column. Any questions? All right, then let's move to the table 3. So in this table 3, we are trying to build the relationship between the TME all and the market enrollment tab, which the sum of the member months should be the same between these two tabs. In this case, because this file only have the lines of business code 3, so you will only see the numbers pop up here. For other columns, this will show you NA if you don't have that numbers being reported in that specific lines of business. So again, you will also see the numbers difference pop up if the number are not what we expected. For example, if I change this member months to some other number, it will show you the difference at the difference column. It could be either be red or blue, depends on which part is higher. Depends on which member months is higher, either higher in market enrolled or higher in the TMEO. So any questions for this one? Right, if not, I'm going to move to the provider check. So for this tab, we are trying to see if the provider organization name you report in the TME Prof, they also showed up in the provider ID tab with the team associated that. So in this case, we have like 2 provider organization names here, and then these 2 are both being reported in the provider ID. Let's say, for example, if we don't have the hospital system Z being reported in the provider ID tab, Then in this case, you will see the red flag, which will show you, hey, this provider organization is not in the provider ID tab, so you need to address this issue before you submit the data to us. So that's for these two tabs, and this risk score, or I will change it to demographic score for validation. This is just how we calculate the weighted average demographic score that we are going to use for in the Tme Validation tab. Any questions? Sorry, I cannot see the chat when I'm presenting, so if you have questions.
No
Okay.
questions about the validation tabs have come in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that's all for today's the data submission template draft, and we will send out this template, the update template, after the meeting. Let me stop sharing. And the next session will be the specification manual, and so I'm going to hand it to Sam.
Thanks, Ishan. So that was quite a few changes to the template, but we're going to go back to the PowerPoint now. Jonda, are you able to share back to where we left off? Let's see. I think we would be on page 18 of the slide deck. And if not, I can always try. Perfect. Yeah, let's start right here on page 1 of the manual changes. So Yishan just went through the template, which is the where a lot of the actual nitty-gritty happens, but along with the template, we sent out the manual that gives all the instructions. So anything that changed in the template is obviously going to have a relevant section in the manual that changes. And so I'm just going to go through a few of those. We do have a lot more to get to, so I'm not going to belabor it and actually read the manual or anything. Obviously, there were some bigger changes that are happening. One of the main ones is changing from risk adjustment to demographic adjustment. And we've got a few more questions about that. So I just want to say it again. I'm probably going to say it at every tag meeting. For the 2022 submission, we are changing from risk adjustment, which is each submitter is using their own risk tools and applying what we were hoping would be concurrent risk adjustment to their book of business, and then supplying us with those numbers to do a risk-adjusted standard deviation, a risk-adjusted measurement of their cost growth. We're now changing to a demographic adjustment only, which is going to be provided by us, provided by OHA. So that means that across all of our submitters, we'll have some consistency, or we'll have like absolute consistency, which will allow us to do more on our end as far as rolling up to the provider levels, and if we so wish, the market and the state levels, but hopefully that won't be necessary. This will align more with other states, the way that they do some of their adjustment as well. So hopefully that clears up some of the confusions, and we'll also be, changing a few of the in the template that Yishan just went through. You saw we occasionally still referenced risk adjustment. We're going to change those to demographic adjustments in order to avoid any of the confusion that might come up when, if you're still going off the old manual, or last year's muscle memory of doing risk adjustment. We're changing to demographic adjustment. So just get used to me saying that for the next the rest of the summer probably. Another bigger change that we talked about here in these tag meetings is introducing the idea of paid amounts for duals. Sarah covered this a little bit at the beginning, so I think everybody's on the same page here. But for lines of business 5 and 6, which are the Medicare and Medicaid duals, respectively, we're going to be using paid amounts. For everyone else, we're still using allowed amounts. We've talked about how these numbers might not be totally aligned, but I think it's best for both sides of the table here that we're changing to paid amounts for those specific lines of business only. And so that'll be in the manual. Let's go to the next slide, which is about attribution. So I mentioned this earlier, and we can talk about it at the end. Having a threshold for making the TME Prov tab. Right now we have it at 0. If you're at 0, if you're rounded down to 0 member months, move them to the unattributed tab. We're seriously considering changing that to maybe a 12-month threshold to include on the TME Prov tab, which would mean if you only had one member going to this provider for a year, and that's 12 months, then that's not that useful. Let's just move it to the unattributed tab. If I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on why that is or is not a good idea. It will certainly make our lives easier. I think it will make your lives easier as well. And I don't think we'll be losing any meaningful data. Those claims will still be captured, but they'll just move to a different location in the template. There are some new inclusions and exclusions in the manual. The excluding risk transfer payments, COVID-related funds that aren't going directly to a provider. I think the commonality here is if it's not going from your organization directly to a provider, then don't include it in the non-claims or the claims, depending on where it goes. And then including 7-Eleven drugs for CCOs. That's a CCO-specific thing, I believe. We have a little bit more language about specifically when you should or should not include 7-Eleven drugs, just for some of the confusion that we had in this last payment year. Let's go to the next slide. And this one's all about submissions for some of the bigger payers or submitters. We do really only want one file submitted per reporter that is listed. However, I think there's some good reasons to make exceptions here. Like pretty specifically, if there's a commercial payer, for example, that also has a CCO, that maybe their names are different, for example, but they're mutually exclusive. It's all commercial dollars and all Medicaid dollars, and they're not going to be overlapping at all on the submission. I think there's good reason to just include it all in one submission so we can talk about it all at the same time and we can do all the analyzing at the same time, and you don't have to worry about multiple templates and multiple files. So hopefully a little bit of clearing up there. If you think you're qualified under the exclusion list, but you're not sure, or like the exception like that I just mentioned, but you're not sure, go and reach out to us. We'll help you figure it out. But this applies to really only like a couple submitters, and we're just trying to make your lives a little bit easier here. Let's go to the next slide. I'm trying to look at some of the questions as they come in. We'll have a little time at the end of this to go over questions. This is some of the more specific stuff, the lessons learned for some clarifications we know we need to make to the manual. We're incorporating some of the FAQs that we just had an FAQ, an entirely different document last year. We're incorporating those into the manual, and we're changing all the references to, this isn't the initial data submission anymore. Like, this is going to be our second data submission. So let's clean up the manual and make sure everybody knows that we're not looking for an initial data submission anymore. We're sophomores now. We're aged. So let's act like it. So I think those are pretty specific, and you can look at those when we send out the manual and finalize the manual and everything. But that's just to let you know that we're making changes as we go. Let's go on to the next slide. This is a reminder from me to you that we're still not truncating high cost outliers. We want you to include all dollars all the way up to the top when you're making your submissions. We know many of the other states, for those of you who do other state submissions, that truncation is required, but not for us. We want all the dollars. We want to include everything you're spending, or everything that is every claim dollar, every non-claim dollar, all the way up. Those are sometimes very meaningful dollars, and we want to capture those, and we want to be able to measure them and talk to you about them. So we're not cutting them off because we don't care. We're not cutting them off because we do care, and we want to see those dollars, and we want to talk to you about them. So don't if you have a high cost outlier and it's driving all of your dollars, don't ignore it and assume that we don't want to hear about it. We will want to talk to you about it. We will want to hear about how that has affected your cost growth from the prior year to the current year. So hopefully that makes sense. I see a hand up, but I can't see whose hand it is. Is it Vince?
Yeah, it's Vince at Regions. So this is something I know I've talked to you all about, and we understand why you're including it. I think my one, and this may be something that the other committee should discuss as from a formal policy or not, but just a recommendation to consider is, I think this is going to continue to be a very big issue. I mean, I haven't been able to go in the data and prove it, but the frequency of these high claims seem to be ticking up for a variety of reasons, like genetic therapies and other things, which may increase year over year. And then also like what you define as so there's consistency. And I understand you want to do it case by case, but how it would apply to each payer when you're looking at it, I just think it might be something that we want to look at and be consistent so that you can explain the data on your end.
I'm going to jump in on that, Vince. Thank you for that suggestion that this might go back to the new advisory committee. I've put that on the list to incorporate in the new committee's work plan. I think it's, we've talked a lot with you all about the importance of aligning with other states and providing consistency in cost growth target programs. And yet this is one place where we are sort of holding the line in our choice to not truncate and what that means. And I hear what you're saying about having consistency in those conversations with payers. And I think that's a really important point that we should take into consideration. I don't think that will change our decision to not truncate outliers in the data submission. It would more likely change how we approach those conversations, but that's a really great flag for us. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Vince. And if you think that's going to come up in the payer conversations, just wait, till we're in the provider conversations where that's going to be right at the top of their list of things they're going to want to talk about as well. So we're not overlooking it. We want to look directly at it actually. So that's why we're trying to include it so we can make sure we have those conversations. I saw somebody else unmuted. Was there another comment on truncation, or can we? I think the next slide is going to be my last slide. Then we'll get into all the questions. Okay, yeah, let's go to the next slide then. Any feedback is good anytime. You guys all have our emails and you can reach out to us. One thing I'm gonna put a plug in here is we put in the manual that when we ask for revisions to the submissions, we gave a 30-day timeline. That ended up being, I think, plenty of time, maybe too much time. And I can confidently say I think it might be too much time because it's about to be May and we're still looking for submissions and resubmissions. That I'm not putting blame on anybody except for maybe a little bit too lenient with some timelines on our end, and maybe we need a little bit more expediency next year to make sure we hit our deadlines. And that's gonna require a little bit more urgency both on the resubmission side with submitters and on our side. So I think I'm putting it on everybody to, if we move the resubmission deadline from 30 days to 15 days, which I think we should, I think there's a good reason for that, and I'm not just trying to be burdensome. And in line with that, I think one reason for resubmission early on was just data confusion, which hopefully this being the second time around, we won't have as much. Also, Yishan went through 3 entire tabs there of validation, which often that was the very first thing we would talk about in the meetings. We would have just a validation conversation about what looked weird and what didn't look weird. Most, if not all, of the checks that we were doing on our end are now just included in the template, so you can do them before they even get to us. So hopefully that will cut down on maybe even months of work that we were doing back and forth. So I think lowering the resubmission deadline is going to be a good idea for everybody here. And we're going to keep having trainings. We're going to keep having these tag meetings. So if there are further thoughts on that, we definitely want to hear them. And I'm going to stop here. I think that's my last slide. for all of the questions. And if there's something that I didn't get answered or somebody else didn't get answered in the actual chat, I'll try to go back through and check. But be interested in hearing from everybody.
There's a question from Ada about members moving between plans in a year that we haven't touched on. I think that's the outstanding question I see.
Members moving between plans, as in between data submitters, Ada, is that what you're thinking?
It was in context to the lower threshold of member months. So if we have a member on our plan for 6 months for a provider and it lowers the threshold and that's all that provider gets, but they're going to a different plan and the other 6 months are there, are you losing visibility to that provider's cost because we're now making them unattributed? So it was just a concern of, by dwindling them down, are the true costs of these providers being reflected when we base it off of member months and low thresholds, and then not attributing them when those dollars were absolutely attributed while they were on our plan?
Yeah, that's fair. I think since we're talking about like 6 months at a time here, and when we roll it up to the provider level, we're looking at like, 5,000 months at a minimum, I think, is the lowest. Generally, those 6 months are immaterial. I guess that could be 6 months of high intensive treatment that would then be lost to the unattributed tab. So there is that consideration. I think that's a risk we're just going to have to be willing to take, as far as not attributing that to a provider if they get lost within the 6 months. Yeah, so yeah, there's a risk here, but yeah, Sarah.
Can I, and this is sausage making in public, which I know we're never supposed to do, so apologies for that. But what if, like, if we're thinking about a threshold, does it make sense to have a combination of member months and dollars in what gets moved over? And so if it's, say, fewer than 10 member months, it moves, but only if it's also above or below a certain dollar amount, to make sure that we're not, like, is there a way to mitigate that risk, or is that just way too complicated to factor in?
Sarah, yeah, you're echoing conversations we've had, and like already when we were trying to figure this out. Is there a good reason to have a double threshold? Once we have a threshold, let's get more specific. And I think we've got the audience here to tell us if that is overly burdensome or not. So if anybody has an immediate thought on that, a double threshold for making the provider tab, what do we think?
I mean, for us, it's certainly a lot more work to find a threshold and then move them over to unattributed, because it's much easier to attribute the dollars because it's right there and in front of us. I don't know what happens to this data from a more global perspective if all providers with matching 10s are being rolled up and looked at as high cost providers across the state. I don't know why we would want to take dollars away. I mean, it takes one transplant member, and all bets are off. So I don't see a need when we have a member month or even an attributed claim because of a member relationship that we should take those dollars away from the provider, even if it rounded down to zero. If on their first 15 days they were on our plan, assigned to that provider, and had a big event, that provider has accountability there, and we want to reflect that.
This might be even more noticeable with things like babies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point. The maternal and postnatal care is going to be more of a concern. I was going to say with with the transplants, I think when we looked at maybe the thresholds, and we're still looking at like what a threshold would be and what that would mean to the bottom line of claims. It's not our early look estimation that we're losing that many dollars. For when we carve off like the 6 months or 10 months worth of TME Prov into the TME unattributed tab, we're not really moving that many dollars. We're mostly just moving rows. But that can change. There can be outliers, of course. So I'm a little surprised to hear that you all are, or some of you are concerned about that, but I'm glad to hear that you are. You're thinking about this in a big picture way, and we certainly want to capture as much as we can. So if there is pushback on this, we don't have to do it. We would probably keep in the 0 member month threshold, frankly, just because that's going to make everybody's lives a little bit easier. But maybe we wouldn't increase it. So if there's a more global concern here, this was primarily for the submitters to a little bit to make it a little bit easier. If that's not the case, then we can leave it where it is.
Can I ask then, especially folks, if you're going to go back and look at your initial data submission and see how many 0 member months you had and how many dollars and like tinker with that a little bit, can we ask, maybe email us feedback, how you feel about keeping 0 or a threshold of 10 or 12 member months in the next, let's say by next Friday? I think that would be really helpful to hear more specific feedback, especially if you want to look at the data before you weigh in on this.
Well, I'm not seeing any other thoughts, Sarah. So I guess everybody's very happy with our changes, and we can probably just move on to the accountability, which is probably what everybody really wants to hear about.
Great. And so restating and plugging things, please send us feedback if you have any questions about what was presented in the draft or these changes today. This is not the final version. There will be a final template and manual published by the end of May that will incorporate any additional changes or cleanup that we make. Please let us know if you have feedback, especially on the member month threshold and moving from PROV to unattributed, and on that 15-day threshold, or shortening to 15 days for resubmissions. We also welcome any questions or comments you have about the new validation tabs. We know this is something that you had said would be helpful, and I think, pressure test that a little bit. And if you have any questions about how we've built that out or interpreting how those validation flags show up for you, it would be really great to hear that in the next couple of weeks as we move toward the final versions. Okay, last call for any comments or questions about the template or the manual before we move on. Okay, let's talk about accountability. So we have 2 topics as part of this agenda item in the next hour. We want to talk about what our process is for starting to develop the performance improvement plan process and template. And then we want to talk about developing the list of reportable and accountable provider organizations. So I will provide a lot of context and backstory for both of these topics, and then tee a couple things up for discussion today. So starting with the performance improvement plans, next slide, please, Jody. So I'm going to start with a refresher about just how accountability works for the cost growth target program and the timing. This is not an immediate thing. We have time to phase this in. We have some initial details about the proposed PIP process that I want to start introducing you to. And just to be clear for today, we're looking for some initial feedback, your reactions, sort of thumbs up, thumbs down, major red flags that you see with what we're proposing. In this case, for all of our accountability mechanisms, we will be doing formal rulemaking. There will be a rules advisory committee. There will be invites and opportunities for you and your organizations to more formally engage with the accountability development. That is not happening here today. This is not your only opportunity. This is an early preview before we get into some of that rulemaking later this year and next year. And I just want to be really clear about that. I know that when we talked about the data submission rulemaking, we did that directly with the tag. In this case, for accountability, there will be a separate rules advisory committee. We know that for performance improvement plans and other accountability mechanisms, there might be others in your organization who want to participate in these conversations, whether that's leadership or some of your government relations folks or some of your quality improvement folks. And we want to make sure that we're not leaving them out of the conversation. So please feel free to share this internally with any others in your organization who might be interested, but know that this is just a very first introduction to this conversation. And we will codify everything through formal rulemaking later. So I think that was enough of my disclaimers. So next slide, I want to recap how the accountability for the cost growth target program works. So this is all content that came out of the implementation committee's recommendations. It's how we've been building all of the operational details for the program. And we've been thinking about accountability in three major buckets. So the first is our statistical confidence threshold. And this is built into the template. This is one of the first things that we'll look at. So only payers and provider organizations that exceed the cost growth target in any given year with statistical certainty might be held accountable. So if we apply that statistical test and there are overlapping confidence intervals and we cannot tell decisively whether or not a payer or provider organization definitively exceeded the cost growth target, then the process stops there. No additional accountability accountability mechanisms would kick in. Second is the conversations to understand the reasons for exceeding the target. And we'll talk more about what some of those reasons are in a few minutes, but there is that whole back and forth of the collaboration. These are some of the stage 3 conversations that we started having with you as a practice run this year. What are the reasons? Were they reasonable reasons or not? And that leads into for those organizations, those payers or providers that exceeded the cost growth target with statistical certainty, where we understand the reason and it was not a good reason, essentially not justifiable, the first accountability mechanism there would be a performance improvement plan. And then finally, we have the escalating accountability mechanism, which is the financial penalty. So this is for payers and provider organizations who exceed the cost growth target with statistical certainty without a good reason in any 3 out of 5 years on a rolling basis. So we still have quite a while before we would get to this escalating accountability mechanism, but it is the third phase of the approach. Next slide, please. So again, to recap, in terms of understanding performance, the intention is that we will have one-on-one conversations with any payer or provider organization that exceeds the cost growth target following statistical testing. Again, we started modeling that this year in those initial stage 3 conversations, sharing findings and interpretations, identifying key factors driving cost growth, sharing supplemental data. That could be OHA's analysis for supplemental data. That could be your own supplemental analysis or documentation of things that you're bringing forward relating to what those cost drivers were. Again, I think we started those conversations and you all got to sort of feel the flavor and the intention of that this year. Next is the determining reasonableness section. So on the next slide, from the implementation committee recommendations in 2021, we have potential factors that may cause an organization to reasonably exceed the cost growth target. So if the reason that you exceeded the cost growth target was found to be one of these reasons, or potentially others that are not listed, this is not a mutually exclusive, exhaustive list, then that would be okay. That is a good reason, and no accountability mechanisms would apply at that point. So some of those potential factors are changes in mandated benefits, new drugs or treatments entering the market, changes in taxes or other administrative factors, changes in federal or state law, acts of God. This is our catch-all for pandemics, natural disasters. We know there's a lot that we have no idea is coming that could really affect healthcare costs. And finally, investments to improve population health and or address health equity. So there's a lot in those, and we know there are questions about how exactly will each of these be defined, and is there a definitive set of criteria? And some of that will be continuing those conversations in rulemaking. Some of the intention here is that these factors are somewhat squishy because we don't know what's going to happen. There could be something unexpected in a given year. And so we wouldn't want to say, to define these categories so narrowly that if something happened that we didn't anticipate, that we wouldn't be able to say, oh yeah, no, that's a totally good reason for exceeding the cost growth target. No accountability applies. So I guess what I'm saying is we understand that you would like some certainty and some details here, totally understandable, but also recognizing that our intent is to make sure that this is flexible because we can't anticipate everything that might happen or what those factors might be. So that was all the backstory on how accountability works and how the process works. So leading up to performance improvement plans, let's say we've gone through all of these steps and we have found an organization has exceeded the cost growth target with statistical certainty. The factors that were causing the cost growth were not one of these good reasons. So next slide, let's talk about performance improvement plans. So The way that everything is currently set up in the recommendations and the way that we are planning on operationalizing this is that PIPs would be required for any payer or provider organization that meets those criteria during any performance year for one or more markets. So there's a lot of sort of ifs there. So it might be that an organization exceeds the cost growth target for commercial, but not for Medicaid and Medicare. It's okay, a PIP would still apply, but it would only be for that commercial market. It might be multiple markets, it might be across the board. It might be in one performance year, but not the next. We are thinking about PIPs as a pretty frequent thing. And this is a key difference in the Oregon approach compared to, say, the Massachusetts approach. Massachusetts also has performance improvement plans as part of their cost growth benchmark program. They have only put one organization on a performance improvement plan in, I want to say, 7 years. Team, correct me if I got that stat wrong, but our committee, our recommendations, our statute all assumes that we will be using PIPs more frequently, and that PIPs are not sort of the end game of accountability, but that are just a quality improvement tool that would be happening throughout the process and throughout the program. Next slide. So just a reminder that accountability does phase in, and that the soonest that PIPs could apply would be for the second year of measurement. So that is cost growth between 2021 and 2022. That will be the data that is submitted in the 2023 cycle, and we'll go through validation in fall of 2023. Early 2024 is likely when we would start talking about whether or not any organizations are put on a performance improvement plan. So I know there's been a lot of stress about what's been happening with COVID and all of the changes that are happening in the market right now. And as we're submitting data, as we're reviewing the data and having these conversations with you, how are we taking this into account? And I think we have been saying it's okay, there's still time, accountability phases in. The soonest anybody would be put on a performance improvement plan is not for another year plus. So just wanted to reaffirm that. The data lag in this program and the cycle of the submissions on the processing means that we're still a little bit of a ways out. And then just a reminder that the financial penalty kicks in even later. The soonest that would apply would be based on the 2026 data submission, because we would have then the full 5 years to look at any 3 out of 5 years. So I'm dumping a lot of information on you. I'm going to pause here just for a second. Are there any questions about the context or how the accountability for the program is intended to work before we get into the details for the PIP? Vince, I see your comment about changes in inflation. Absolutely, inflation is a hot topic and something that we would expect to come up as part of those determination of reasonableness conversations. Okay, let's get into some more of the specifics then for the PIP. So on the next slide, please. We do have some high-level guidance from the implementation committee recommendations on the PIPs. And that guidance is that PIPs should be collaboratively developed between OHA and the payer or provider organization. The PIP should be multi-year to allow time for improvement. Entities should submit annual PIP progress reports, and that the PIPs and the progress reports would be publicly available. So we're intending that there'll be transparency and all this would be posted. So using that as our guidance, we've started working on this. So next slide. I think I said all of this. We are starting the process, even though, again, we'll codify this through official rulemaking later, and this doesn't apply until the next data submission cycle. So sorry, one more slide. Okay, so starting with some of our proposals for how the PIP process would work. We are proposing that once we go through all of those steps that I've outlined and determine that a PIP is required, there would be a couple of things that happen. So OHA would send notice and say, officially, a PIP is required. Then that entity would have 90 days to develop and submit their proposed PIP using a required template, which we'll talk about in a minute. OHA will provide guidance and examples of how to complete that PIP template. OHA will offer technical assistance to entities to help develop their PIP. So that could look like the written guidance. There could be a recorded webinar or some training materials available about how to develop your PIP. OHA would also be available to review and give feedback on a draft PIP prior to submission. Is this the right direction? Kinds of things. After the entity submits their proposed PIP, OHA would review it and assess based on some published criteria. And then OHA would either approve the PIP and say, great, here's your PIP, good to go, timeline starts now. This organization, this entity is now working on their PIP, or potentially require the entity to resubmit their proposed PIP with changes if the proposed PIP didn't meet that the established criteria. Next. So once that PIP has been approved and the entity is implementing it, we are proposing that entities would submit quarterly progress reports to OHA on their PIPs, and that the approved PIPs and those progress reports will be published to OHA's website. They would also potentially be shared or highlighted with the new Cost Growth Target Advisory Committee at certain points, and or the Oregon Health Policy Board. Both bodies would be interested in this type of performance improvement and accountability work. We do have a note here that there might be some confidential information in the PIPs or the progress reports, and that we would have some mechanisms for being able to redact that before anything was posted publicly or shared publicly with the committee or the board. Next. So some of the parameters for the proposed PIP process and what would be in a PIP itself. A proposed PIP must focus on addressing the root cause or causes that led an entity to exceed the cost growth target. So we know that it might not be, it's very unlikely, but possible, that there's going to be just one clear thing. Like, this was the only reason that you tipped over the cost growth target in the year. And maybe that's true, maybe that's not true. Maybe there are multiple reasons that contributed to an organization exceeding the cost growth target in a given year. So we are switching over to some quality improvement language, and those reasons for exceeding the cost growth target would be the root cause that a PIP should be based on. So let me give maybe a poor example of this, but a conversation that we've been having a lot is workforce costs. So we know that workforce costs are up, especially because of COVID, and salaries, labor, all of that is a cost driver. And we've had conversations with a number of organizations who are really concerned that what can they do about that? Is that a good reason? Maybe this is what causes us to exceed the cost growth target. What do we do about it? So we would want to know, if an organization exceeded the cost growth target, was it because of labor costs specifically, or were there other reasons? It may be that labor costs were in the mix, but not sort of what tipped anyone over. So that would be part of all of those one-on-one conversations, looking at supplemental data, trying to understand what those root causes were. Once those root causes would be identified, the PIP should be based in the root cause and not something else. So again, sort of ham-fisted example, but let's say that for an organization who exceeded the cost growth target, there were a couple of reasons. Let's say the primary reason was price growth, but labor costs were also something that they were concerned about. If a PIP was submitted focusing only on the labor costs and not on price growth, there might be some concerns about that because price growth was the root cause. So again, sort of squishy and complicated. We know that this is going to be messy and going to almost certainly vary by organization, possibly vary by market. And we want to make sure that the PIP process and template is flexible enough to accommodate that. So PIPs must have at least one identified root cause, but maybe also multiple. That would be up to the organization for what they propose they're working on. And PIPs would be designed to be implemented and completed within 24 months. So reflecting that multiple year longer timeline from the implementation committee guidance. And next slide. So in the PIP template, entities would be asked to address all of the following, and the template would be structured around these bullet points. So for each root cause in the proposed PIP, there would be strategies to address it, key activities to implement the strategy, a balancing strategy to avoid negative impacts. So again, making sure that we're not affecting service availability, quality of care, network access, any of those negative impacts, particularly on populations that might be experiencing health inequities. We would be looking for measures, both outcome measures and balancing measures, to understand progress on the PIP and those key activities. We would ask for a plan for adjusting the strategy over time. So if changes happen, if there are negative effects, how would that be addressed? If the strategy or the key activities do not appear to be working, how would the organization revise their PIP? And then if there are any generated savings that might result from the activities in the PIP, how would those savings be passed on to payers and or to patients, depending on the organization? So that's all pretty high level. The guidance that we're envisioning would spell this out in a lot more detail. It would provide examples of what we're talking about in this case. A lot of this, again, is coming really strongly from the quality improvement world. So this, for those of you with quality improvement backgrounds, this should be pretty familiar in terms of language and what we're talking about, especially with the balancing measure concepts and the root causes. Yeah. Okay, let me stop there. Jorandi, can you go ahead to slide 38, please? Jump 2 more ahead. I'm going to stop talking and just flag a couple of things that we are looking for your feedback on or just sort of gut reactions to. So is the 90-day timeline to submit a proposed PIP, does that seem reasonable? Does the proposed technical assistance that I outlined seem helpful? What else might help your organization in developing a PIP if that needed to happen? Progress reporting. So the implementation committee suggested, or their guidance said, annual reporting. That doesn't seem like enough, but we're proposing quarterly. Is quarterly too much? What's the right balance for progress reporting? And then any feedback on just the high-level proposed PIP template contents.
So this is Greg Daniel. And my first thought is, your 90 days, I can see that working. But then when you start talking about looking forward to updates, it's going to take time for some things to be in there, to measure them. I mean, I could come in and say, I'm going to do something. 3 months later, half of it's still IBNR. So you can't do it. So I don't think your quarterly is going to work. I think that's the one that you might have to at least do no more than like a 6-month follow-up or something like that.
This is Deborah from Oregon, and I'm thinking about what is the definition of completed in 24 months, and it leads me to think, what does complete mean? And I'm also thinking, if you're interested in tracking pre-post, PIP cost outcomes, we have to build significant time in there for claims run out, because not every member that will receive the PIP intervention or that kind of thing, if we're looking at cost, if we're happening at a individual, patient level, will enter on day 1 of the PIP. And, so when we get to the end of 24 months, we either need to have at least another year of claims run out to see what happened, for those members. So talk to me a little bit about how to incorporate claims run out and the fact that we have people and providers will start the intervention at different time periods during the 24-month period. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, Deborah, that's a great question. So a couple of thoughts. One is that in terms of pre-post is the cost growth target data submission each year, which is going to be off cycle from the PIP timeline potentially. So when we're saying outcome and balancing measures in the PIP reporting, that's likely going to be more process focused. I don't know that it could be, the actual cost, because we don't want to either create additional burden on entities that then have to build a whole new reporting structure when we already have the cost growth target data submission reporting structure as the ultimate measurement. But then we do want some insight. So maybe that's process, maybe that's not. I also, and this is something that is definitely going to be worth more conversation, and I'd really love feedback from you all or others in your organization at some point who focus on quality improvement. I don't know that we are assuming that a lot of the types of things that would be in a PIP are necessarily provider-patient level interaction. That might not be true. I might be way off base here, but I think we're thinking about things like structural costs. So, for example, is a strategy something like addressing payer-provider contracting? And when we're thinking about timelines, like what's the next cycle of provider contracts that could be renegotiated to address some of this? Or maybe it's things like moving towards VBP. I think it's less like we have 5 high-cost patients that we want to move onto a lower-cost drug, and we're going to, maybe that's what the cost drag will be. Maybe it's those 5 patients that are the reason that an entity is above the cost growth target. But I don't know that we were approaching this and thinking that PIPs were sort of patient-provider interaction level. And I would love a gut check on that. Or should we be incorporating that perspective?
Oh, I think that you should have that as an option, as a potential thing to help control costs. I mean, I'll give you an example. Is everybody, you could have like emergency, care was way up, and you come up with a program to deal with, we'll say frequent flyers to the ER, that kind of stuff. So I think it should be out there. I think that when you bring up the idea of contracting, you have to realize the timelines of contracting is going to be way out, because if we talk about the PIP, we'll say we're talking about it in January, February after it's been filed, you may not be able to even get a change in contracting until the next January. So you may be at least a year out before any contractual changes could take effect.
Exactly. And I think that's why we want to say, all right, if you are saying that the best strategy that you have to address cost growth and to address your key cost drivers is contracting, and you have to wait for the next cycle, that's one reason to have that 24-month timeline. And there may be no activities in the first 12 months of that PIP. And we'll have to think about that, because this whole timing and claims lag and contracting cycles are not aligned, and that's messy. But I think I hear what you're saying about having that patient-provider component be an option here. I also want to be careful that we are not setting up a process that sort of encourages. Ooh, I don't know how to say this well, so I'm going to say this probably poorly. I don't know how to set up an option, and I would like feedback on how to set up an option that doesn't encourage a lot of busy work. So it may be that there are those 5 patients, or there's a frequent ED utilizer program that you want to set up. Is that actually your major cost driver? Is that the most value? Is that program going to be what helps your organization meet the cost growth target next year? If yes, then great. Want to support that, want to have the option for that. But don't want to set up a thing that says, okay, you need to have a bunch of sort of miscellaneous quality improvement activities, none of which are sort of high cost, high volume, in a way that would really affect organization level performance relative to the cost growth target. It doesn't mean that those aren't valuable initiatives, doesn't mean that there's not really great quality improvement work happening. I don't know that that's what we would want to pull into the PIP as the focus, because the PIP is really supposed to be focused on what's the most critical thing that an organization could be doing to help meet the cost growth target in the next cycle. But I don't know, help me think through this. Angela, yep, love that. Email with feedback, questions to discuss internally. We can do that. And again, recognizing that we've been really focusing TAG membership and participation on data submission, your technical teams, and you might not feel like you want to wade into this conversation.
This is Don from Providence Health Plan. I'm thinking about PIPs, and if it's possible for us to classify PIPs into like 2 general classifications as far as root cause. I mean, there would be root causes that would fall into a general classification of structural reasons, which probably contracting would be probably the clearest one. Then there would be the second wildcard general classification of root causes, which would be like one-time shocks to the system. I can't think of something, some good example for that, probably other than COVID. Now, provided we can generally classify the root causes for our cost escalations above the target, provided we can agree to deal with that in a reasonable way. So as Greg had said earlier, if it's a structural clause and we do not have the opportunity to change that until next year, and the PIP says we'll reevaluate 24 months, that's reasonable for that type of case, right? For a situation where we've classified it as a one-time shock to the system, then we probably would be expecting a more direct, within 12 months resolution or game plan to resolve the issue. So that's my 10 cents here.
That's great. Thanks, Tom. And I want to reiterate that for some of those, one-time shocks to the system, those one-time shocks might actually be part of the determination of reasonableness conversation. And if in that conversation, we say, all right, that one-time shock was completely out of your control, that there wouldn't be a PIP. It would not lead to accountability and PIPs to address it. I don't want to say blanket that would always be the case. It might be that there are some one-time shocks to the system that do need to be addressed that would, not be considered reasonable. So again, squishy and unclear if we can ever have a truly definitive list, but absolutely, I like the idea of sort of categorizing root causes and potentially different structures or expectations for the PIP content depending on what type of root cause it was. Any other immediate reactions? Okay. When we send out the updated 2022 data submission template this afternoon, we will also send a summary of some of these prompt questions. And you are please distribute and discuss internally. Next month's tag meeting is not the only opportunity. We just are starting this conversation. This conversation about accountability will continue with the new advisory committee. Once they start, we'll bring questions back to the tag occasionally. And again, as I mentioned, we will have a full rules advisory committee process. So this is not a short window for feedback, but we do want to get the conversation started. And if there are others in your organization who you think should start maybe tracking the tag more closely because we're starting to have these conversations, let us list. You're welcome to share this internally and start figuring out how to have those conversations. Thank you for going through this intro with us today. Okay, switch gears for our last topic, which is reportable and accountable provider organizations. Johnny, let's go ahead 2 slides, please. All right, so again, I'm going to give some quick context. Ishan's going to help me with some technical details, and then we are going to open it up for your reactions. So, reminder, the cost growth target applies at 4 levels: statewide, the market level, the payer level, and the provider level. We have mostly focused on the payer level. That is, most of you are representing the payers as the data submitters. We've been focusing on accountability and measurement at the payer level, and we really haven't tapped into the provider organization conversation at all. And part of that is because the first question is, which provider organizations are we talking about? Who is even part of the cost growth target program when we're talking about providers? So next slide. We have some implementation committee recommendations that we are working off of as our basis for this. And those recommendations are provider organizations that could, in theory, take on contracts where they are responsible for the total cost of care and can be held accountable for total medical expenditures. So that would include health systems, that would include hospitals that have primary care providers, that would include medical groups that have primary care providers, and that would include IPAs and or ACOs. So essentially agreeing to take on responsibility or taking on those contracts in a total cost of care approach. When we're talking about this, when we're talking about provider organizations, we are talking about the highest level of rolling up to a provider organization possible. At no point are we talking about individual clinicians, and at no point are we talking about probably small one-doc shops. And the reason for that is on the next slide. The second recommendation from the implementation committee is that provider organizations need to meet some minimum size thresholds. So that would be at least 10,000 unique all-payer attributed lives, or at least 5,000 unique attributed lives under any one line of business. So for the purposes of this conversation and thinking about how we actually identify those provider organizations, we're going to switch from talking about lives to member months because all of the data submission is calculated in member months. So just recognizing that transition. Next slide. So we've had a lot of conversations, a lot of questions about, okay, well, you have these implementation committee recommendations, but who actually counts? Who actually is a provider organization? So last year, we used some of the all-payer all claims data and ran an analysis using 2018 data to try to identify provider organizations that might meet that criteria, that we were pretty sure met the size threshold and that had that affiliated primary care component. We published that list back March of last year, and that was circulating as just a draft, like a heads up, hey, maybe the cost growth target program could apply to you. We identified 55 organizations on that list, but that was never our end goal. The APAC analysis was never the definitive source of which provider organizations would be part of the program. That was always going to be coming from the data submission templates. And now that we have almost all of the initial data submission finalized and validated, we have been combining all of that data and preparing to identify the provider organizations. So I'm going to kick it to Yishan to talk about how we created that list before talking about who's actually on the list.
Thanks, Sarah. Could you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so for this year, because we already have the 2021 data submissions, which is for the calendar year 2018 to 20, we have plenty of the data for provider organizations from all the payers. We are going to use this data to identify who are the provider organizations meet the criteria. Or more specifically, we are going to use the member months and the provider organization names from the Tme Prof tab to identify who are the organizations meet the criteria, where 5,000 lives roughly equal to the 60,000 member months, and 10,000 lives is roughly equal to the 120,000 member months in our data submissions. So we are going to combine all the payers files to get this information for the member months and provider organization names. We also use the teams information from the provider ID tab from all the payers files to see if multiple teams could be rolled up into a single provider organization. Next slide, please. So here is just an example how we rolled up all the teams into, like, maybe some multiple teams could be rolled out into one single provider organization. So in this example, provider A who report the team starting with 222 with the name MU Clinic. Pair B also report this team, but with slightly different names, which is called MU clinics and offices, because the teams are the same. So when we combine the pair files, we will consider, as long as the team is the same, we consider them as the same provider organization. And same for the pair B and pair C, they both report the team starting with 111, but with slightly different names. But because their teams is the same, so we will consider them as the same provider organization. And for the multiple teams rolled up, we will consider the names which being reported in the provider ID tab to see if it's possible to roll up the teams into under one single provider organization. It could be for example, in this example, it could be the acronym or the forename difference. So University of Missouri could, it's a forename, but for the acronym, it's a MU. So in this case, we will roll up into one. Or it could be a hospital system which at different locations. In that case, we may be also to roll up into one single provider organization. So that's how we rolled up the provider organizations from multiple pair files. And I think we have an email sent out to send you the list of the provider organizations. We've been rolling out using the files we have currently, which are the validated files. And I just want to say that this is not the finalized list of the provider organizations that will be reportable or accountable, because we are still need to reach out to provider organizations to make sure our list teams are correct, or do we miss any teams, or are there any teams being misreported? So that's just at least for us to do the provider outreach, but it is not a finalized provider organization list.
Thanks, Yishan.
Yeah.
So I just dropped the list, the document in the chat. It was also in the tag meeting materials that were sent out. It includes a little bit more detail about how the provider organizations were identified, and then it includes the list. Again, this is a preliminary list. I don't know how much this list will actually shift. I think thinking about thinking about the outstanding data submissions that are not yet finalized, we're pretty close. I don't know that we'll see a ton of movement on this list, this is likely the list of provider organizations. But again, we do want to just make sure that there aren't any changes with those last 3 data submissions or in how these provider organizations have been rolled up. So in that file, you can see the list of provider organizations. You can see the number of member months that have been attributed across all of the payer data submissions. And this, we have about 50 organizations on the list statewide. So I want to talk a little bit less about sort of who all is on the list and what that all means, but talk more about what we're going to do next. So next slide, please, Johnny. So our plan is that in May, so starting next week, we are going to start reaching out to these organizations on the list. Some of those organizations may already be aware of the cost growth target program. Some of them are already participating in the tag, have already been participating in the implementation committee, closely tracking this work. Others may not know about this program at all. We had originally had a whole provider education and outreach strategy that we were going to be rolling out last year. We were asked to put that on hold when the Delta surge happened because of bandwidth and provider organization ability to think about some of these other things. And so we had put all of that on pause, and we need to pick that back up this spring. So we know that for some folks on this list, this is going to be brand new information, and we want to provide some orientation, some introduction, like what even is the cost growth target? Why am I on this list? What does this mean for me? So we will be probably doing some educational webinars. We might be working with some organizational partners and associations to make sure we're reaching folks. We'll be inviting provider organizations to start engaging in the tag meetings going forward. And then we plan on setting up validation conversations. So just like we did with you as the data submitters, we want to have similar conversations with the provider organizations. We want to say, here's what we see in the initial data. If this was a cost growth target performance year, here's what your performance would have looked like. Let's talk about that. We know from the other states that are a little bit ahead of us in rolling out their cost growth target programs that sometimes, depending on the payer mix and how much of the provider data was coming from a given payer, that we might need to pull payers into those conversations, especially in the cases where payers and providers may already be sharing data about total cost of care, and those data might look different than what we have out of the cost growth target data submissions, given the attribution and how the dollars are rolled up. So we are giving essentially you all as data submitters a heads up that we might be tapping you for some of those conversations to participate. Or if a given provider organization has questions about why their data says what it says, that data is coming from you as the payer, and we'll want to be closing that loop. So a lot more to come on this rolling out starting in May. Those of you who are both payer and provider organizations, you've already gone through this with us on the payer side. We expect it to look very similar on the provider side, but there might be others in your organization that need to join those conversations, or it might be a slightly different mix of folks. So we'll be reaching out. Those of you who are both payers and providers will probably be reaching out to you first because you've already gone through this once, and we want to start testing those conversations and refining them with you. So heads up that this is May. It is unlikely that we'll be ready to tap individual payers into conversations, very early on. That might be happening later this summer as we prepare sort of similar data outputs for what this all looks like at the provider level and start those conversations. And then final disclaimer, none of the provider organization level data, none of the performance data from this initial measurement period, 2018, 19, or 20, will be publicly reported at either the payer level or the provider level. This is all just a practice run. This is all working out the validation steps. This is all understanding how the program works and how these conversations work. Public reporting will start with next year's cycle, or I guess this year's cycle. It is 2022. So we want to make sure that people know that that's coming. But again, none of this initial data will be publicly reported at the payer or provider level. So any questions or concerns or feedback on how we've created the provider list, our next steps for provider organization outreach, your role as payers in those conversations? Any reactions to any of this?
Hi, it's Vince. This is all really helpful. quick question, and I don't know if you know this or not, but are there any groups of payers that are like right on that line of kicking over the threshold, and any thoughts about like what's going to happen if they go, you know, alternate years or something, just because of the way the data plays out? And how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I actually can answer that question. So this PDF is the list of like absolutely above the line. We have a second document that we will likely push out at some point as part of the outreach, and I'm calling it the on notice list. So currently below the threshold, but maybe close to it. And we want to make sure that there's some outreach to those provider organizations, because yeah, we know there could be market changes. The list of provider organizations will be constructed every year out of the data submissions, and it could change. We talked a lot internally, and I think with the tag, about whether or not there should be a one-time provider list, and then once you're on it forever, and we decided against that. So there can be changes to the list of provider organizations, just like there can be changes to the data submitters in a given year. And we would have to do the outreach, the education, the onboarding for any of those new entities. We do want to reach out to any of the provider organizations on sort of this on notice list and provide some similar orientation to the program. I think for me, that's a sort of phase 2 for the provider outreach. We really want to focus on those that are definitively on the list. And we expect would be on the list year after year, just because of size and sort of reach of their organization. And make sure that we have those conversations locked down, that we have the right contacts, that we've started the data validation conversations. But yeah, I think long term, we want to make sure we're reaching out and engaging with the broader list of those who may be included in a future year.
Can you say if the may be included list is a big list, or I mean, is it just? I'm just curious.
It's not, and I'm not looking at the data, so I don't want to quote numbers to you.
Yeah.
But when we were looking, there aren't a lot that are sort of like, you know, 15 member months away from tipping over the edge. Like there's some pretty clear like cliffs in this, and part of that is because of how the attribution worked. Because all of the data that you reported was already being attributed up to the highest level you could. That means that a lot of that sort of noise for the smaller provider organizations has already been addressed in the roll-up.
Thanks,
Sarah. This is just specific to me and Kaiser. I wasn't sure how you were going to reach out to the providers, and since I am the central hub for both, I would hope that you just send it to me. The reason being is we're a big organization, and I'd hate if suddenly you had somebody showing up that is from one of our physician groups or something, and we're like, no.
Yep. Let me tell you about how we're building our contact list. This is probably relevant for several of you, not just Kaiser. If you are a provider and payer organization, or if you're a provider organization that has already been participating in the tag, the implementation committee, or is on our interested parties distribution list, we are starting with you. We're building a contact list, and so everyone that we're already engaged with will be receiving this outreach email in May. So Greg, absolutely, this will be going to you. Same for the Providence folks. We will be contacting you all directly. If you need to navigate internally, if there are other folks from the medical group side that you need to pull in, we will defer to you on how to do that, but you will be our key contacts because we know that you already know about the program. In the cases of some of the organizations on the list, we don't have someone who's already engaged, and we might have to do a little bit more cold calling and trial and error to find the right contacts.
Thanks.
Any other?
Sarah, this is Dom again, Providence Health Plan. Yeah, you did mention that same thing holds for Providence. So the contacts list that we're talking about is purely Providence Health Plan. So yes, the same thing holds. If you reach out to us, we too will bring in who we need to bring in on these conversations. But thank you. I'm glad you mentioned.
Yeah, thank you for prompting me to talk about it. So yeah, all the Providence folks participating in the tag that have been participating in the advisory committee or the implementation committee, you are all on the list. So I think we are going to err on the side of over communicating until we find the right people. Okay. Anything else about this? I know, again, that this is we mostly have payers participating in the tag at this point, and I know that some of you did have questions earlier on about, who should I be working with? Like, which of my provider organizations that I contract with should I care about relative to the cost growth target? So hopefully this list gives you a better sense of sort of the net of inclusion, but we will continue to refine it as the last couple of data submissions are finalized. All right. I think we made it. I think we made it through the full agenda. So last slide, Gerandi. Our next meeting is Wednesday, May 25th. We will be reviewing the final data template and manual for 2022. We'll be talking about standard deviation methodology. We may have some other stuff coming up between now and then. Hopefully there will be an advisory committee that is appointed at that point, and we'll be able to share all of that with you, as well as the committee work plan and thinking about committee and tag intersections, and probably some other stuff that we haven't anticipated yet. Final call for comments, questions. Team, did I miss anything else that we wanted to raise today?
I don't think so. I think you got it.
Thanks, Sam. All right, we will send out the template this afternoon. We will also send out the feedback questions about the PIPs this afternoon. Looking for feedback on things in the next couple of weeks. Sorry, feedback on the template in the next couple of weeks. Feedback on the PIPs, that is the start of a conversation that will go on for quite a while. And as always, you have our email address. Please feel free to reach out with any questions or feedback. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll talk to you in May.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, thank you.
Bye.